Hello, my name is Martin Nielsen and I'm a horse parasitologist, and welcome here to my lab. This is the fourth episode of this video series, the parasite journey through the horse's life. So we're going with the parasites in the order of appearance through the horse's life. So if you haven't yet watched the other three episodes, I do recommend you go back and watch those. Today's parasite is a really exciting parasite for me. I often refer to it as my pet parasite. It's the one I've worked with the most, and I did my entire PhD on it. So I'm really excited to share this knowledge with you today. So today we're going to talk about large strongyles. And so that's something you might hear a lot. We learned about the small strongyles in episode 3. So now we're going to go with their cousins here in the large strongyle group. Now, when we talk about large strongyles, there's actually several different species, up to 16, that can all infect the horse, but we're really primarily only interested in one, and that's the one we call the bloodworm. Now again, if you watched the last episode, you have now learned that there's no such thing as small bloodworms. There are only bloodworms, and you don't have to call them large bloodworms because there's only this one kind. So the bloodworm, Strongylus vulgaris in Latin, that's one of the large strongyles. Now, I actually have a few specimen jars here. They are 3D mounted. I'm gonna show you some pictures here on the screen in a bit. But this is actually some female Strongylus vulgaris, so female parasites that have about this size. They're a little bit longer than a centimeter, maybe 15 millimeters, and those were the females. So here we have some boys of the bloodworm. They are a little bit smaller. That's always the case when it comes to parasites in general. So these over here are actually a little bit larger. These are the cousin. We call them the flankworm. They're closely related to our bloodworms. They don't migrate in the blood, and they're called Strongylus edentatus, a little bit larger, as you notice. And just for comparison, I've made this point before. These are the small strongyles. I don't know if you can even see them here, but they are just, in comparison, so much smaller. I can also show you this picture where we have a good close-up of them right here. Again, making the point that you may see large strongyle parasites in the poop of your horse in case it should have them, but you may not have a good enough eye to see these smaller strongyles. So that's one important point about this parasite. And the other one I want to make is they all make the exact same type of parasite egg. We call that, guess, a strongyle egg. So whether it's small strongyles or large strongyles, the eggs all look the same. And here's an example. So we can't use the shape, the size, whatever of these eggs to tell them apart or to say whether or not there could be any bloodworms around. We have diagnostic methods developed specifically for detecting bloodworms in horses. There is a DNA detection method. We call that a PCR. There is a blood method where we measure antibodies in the blood sample against the bloodworm. And then there is the larval culture where we take those parasite eggs and let them develop into larval stages that we can then tell apart. And then looking at specific morphological characteristics, we can say whether this horse has bloodworms or not. And so talk to your veterinarian about how to test for bloodworms in case you have a concern that some of your horses may have or have had those parasites. And so the exciting section of these videos for me is always talking about the life cycle. I am a true parasitologist, and every time I say this life cycle is really fascinating and unique, and you're going to go, well, he said that about the last parasite too. Yeah, but that's because they all have unique characteristics that actually sets them apart somewhat. So let's look at this chart. Yeah, at a first glance, it kind of looks like the small strongyles we covered in the last video. You have this direct, straight life cycle. You have that one route of infection. That's the fecal oral route. So horses are eating grass that's contaminated with poop, and parasitic larvae, and then they get infected that way. Now, the exciting part is what happens once these larvae are inside the horse. Now, the bloodworms, yeah, you can try and guess, they make it into the blood. So they migrate and make their way into the intestinal blood vessels, and then they migrate upstream all the way up to the aorta, which is the main blood vessel that's supplying the entire body of the animal. And then they hang out there in that area and the main branches that are right there off of the aorta for about 4 months. So this parasite is sort of a slowly grinding, taking its time kind of a parasite that isn't ever in any rush. And it grinds through this development and migration and long journey, and it changes stage a couple times while in these blood vessels. After about 4 months, it starts thinking about, well, I think it's time to settle and get back and find myself a nice, cute wife or husband. And then they take their slide, basically the vessel tree, and they get basically just transported passively down to the intestine again, and then they make it inside the intestinal lumen, and that's where they get their cute little offspring. That altogether takes 6 months for the bloodworm parasite. That's a long time for all of that to happen. And actually the bloodworm, that's the quick one when you talk about the large strongyles. So, you know, the flankworm over here can take almost a year to complete its life cycle. So these large strongyles, they are in no hurry. They take their time. So a difference between the large strongyles and the small strongyles is also that you may remember that arrested development. You remember me talking about the teenagers that are hanging out in their rooms and only coming down for whenever they want some food? Yeah, and they can stop and halt that life cycle and put it on hold for periods of time. Yeah, that's unique to the small strongyles. The large strongyles haven't figured out to do that. Or you could argue they don't need to, because, you know, with the lengthy migration phase of several months, the timing is actually quite perfect. Horses acquire the parasites over the course of a grazing season, and then when that season is over, then all of that migration, that happens during the winter months. And by about the time of spring, when the horses are turned out on pasture again and the grass is growing and everything is warm and nice, that's when these parasites are back in the intestine and cranking out those eggs that can come out with the feces. Now, the external phase, that development from egg to third stage parasitic larvae, that infective stage, that's identical to the small strongyles. So if you're wondering about what are the factors affecting that, how long will these larvae survive, that whole discussion, go back and watch episode 3. It's the exact same for the large strongyles. So how common are bloodworms nowadays? And, you know, if you go to the grocery store, you might, over there in the fishing aisle, you might find bait that is labeled bloodworm. It's not the same as this. It's totally different, but if you Google the word bloodworm, that might show up. Now, the bloodworms in the horses are very, very rare nowadays. Or they are rare as long as people deworm their horses. Now, some herds of horses, like wild horses that never get dewormed, they have bloodworms. Our research herd here at the University of Kentucky, yeah, the one that has not been dewormed since 1979, all of those horses have bloodworms. Now, I should remember to say that none of our research horses have ever had any parasitic disease that can be associated with bloodworms or any other worm for that matter. So that's just food for thought. But once you start deworming, you will see the occurrence of bloodworm really decline dramatically. And in many, many herds, in many equine operations around the world, this parasite is virtually non-existent, or it is prevalent at a very, very low level. If you don't deworm very often, and there's a critical point to where you might actually be deworming too little, then there is a risk of this parasite coming back. And we've documented this in our research. And if you look at the American Association for Equine Practitioners, that's the horse veterinarians in the US, we have a guideline document for how to approach parasite control, and we do talk about the minimum number of dewormings a horse needs in any given year, and that is primarily to keep the bloodworms away. So you can look that up or talk to a veterinarian about what the current recommendations are for deworming horses. And if you keep those, you're unlikely to actually ever encounter a bloodworm. But as I discussed earlier, there are ways to test for it, and you can talk to a veterinarian about testing your horses if you think you might have had some bloodworms, or if a horse had any kind of disease that could be associated with bloodworms. So the other thing that's worth remembering, and this is something we know from our herd of horses that all have bloodworms, is that the older these horses get, the fewer the worms they have, and once they get up to certain adult age, a lot of them actually don't have any bloodworms at all. So there's some kind of self-vaccination going on. You can say that the parasite kind of works as a vaccine against itself, and you can argue, well, from a parasite standpoint, that might not be the smartest thing to do, and maybe it's because it sort of overdid it a little bit. Do you really have to migrate in the blood system for 4 months? Is that really necessary, bloodworm? Maybe not, but but it's still around. So apparently it works for the bloodworm, and then we can't really criticize it for it. But it kind of vaccinates the horses, and so if horses are exposed, eventually they will become quite immune to this parasite. So, talking about disease, this parasite is, if you read the books and the old textbooks and articles, it's often called the most dangerous parasite of horses. It's been called the horse killer. Here's one example of an article that was published in 1975, and there's something to that. There are some distinct lesions that this parasite can cause. So we look here at a normal horse. Here is the aorta with those holes that are the main branches, completely beautiful looking, smooth, pale white. There's nothing that interrupts that blood flow in this picture. And then here's a picture from a horse that's infected. You can see, well, there's an obvious difference here. It kind of looks like a marinara meat sauce kind of scenario that this parasite is causing. And actually, it's interesting that this in itself really doesn't cause any discomfort or disease. It's just a reaction that the horse is mounting to the parasite, and there's a lot of blood clot formation building around the parasite. But what happens in very rare cases is that some of these pieces of blood clot, and actually even sometimes the parasites themselves, when they're carried downstream and getting ready to make it back to the large intestine, they can clog some of those blood vessels, basically occlude them, put a cork in the vessel, and then there's a whole segment of intestine that doesn't get its oxygen and nutrient supply. And when a piece of tissue, regardless of what it is, does not get enough oxygen and nutrient, it will die. And that process, we call it necrosis, is very painful to the horse at first, but then the stuff dies, and it becomes numb right there. But then you have a piece of intestinal wall that no longer is vital, no longer is active, and that bacteria can grow over it and get into the abdominal cavity and then cause infection and inflammation there. And so that's what causes the disease. Here's a picture of a piece of intestine with that lighter area there. That's the dead tissue where the intestinal wall no longer has that oxygen supply. This process, when that happens, is life-threatening to the horse. It can be fixed, it can be cured, but it often takes surgery to do that, and surgery as early as possible. Now, this happens extremely rarely, and if you don't see the parasite at all, you don't have anything to worry about. And once again, I said this before, our research herd, we have 20 horses in that research herd. We've kept it since 1979. We have never seen a single case of this. even though they all get Strongylus vulgaris. So that's just food for thought. It is not in the interest of the parasite to kill the horse. That's kind of stupid. Now, this parasite may not be the smartest. I already said that it's vaccinating itself against itself, and that also doesn't seem like a smart strategy. But this is how it works. And when it comes to treatment, then we actually have some good news for you, because there is no resistance developed in this parasite at all, and we're still waiting for it to happen. It's interesting because we've been treating with the wormers for a long time. This parasite just hasn't been able to figure out how to develop resistance, and we don't know if it's ever going to. So the good news for you is that you can still pick any dewormer on this shelf and it will work against bloodworms. Now, just keep in mind that they don't all work against all of the same stages. It's just a matter of their spectrum. So some dewormers will only work against the intestinal stages, and others will work against both the stages in the intestine, but also those migrating larvae that I talked about earlier. So the parasite apparently also hasn't been smart enough to even figure out how to become resistant, which is interesting because a lot of the other worms already have. And so that's the end of this presentation about the bloodworm parasite. So what do we want to leave with? Well, it is the only true bloodworm. It's the Marinara meat sauce parasite that just doesn't seem to be the smartest of the bunch. It vaccinates against itself. It hasn't figured out how to develop resistance, and sometimes it causes too much damage. So with that, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you again next time in the next episode. Thanks.